meeting is being recorded.
All right. Welcome everyone to the February 15th, 2023 NYCERS investment meeting. Ms. Winery, will you please call the roll?
Good morning, Chair, Mayor's Office.
Brian Berge, representing Mayor Eric Adams, present, along
Controller.
with alternate trustees Kevin Liu and Shuman Ture. Sorry.
Thank you. Controller's Office.
Allison Hirsch, representing Controller Brad Lander, along with alternate trustee John Dorsey.
Public Advocate's Office.
Elizabeth Guzman, representing Public Advocate Jimani Williams.
Borough President Manhattan.
Isha Sutton James, representing Borough President Mark Layton.
Borough President Brooklyn.
Karina Lozada, representing Borough President Antonio Reynoso.
Borough President Bronx.
Janet Peguero, representing Bronx Borough President Vanessa Algebra.
Borough President Queens.
Alan Swisher for Queensborough President Donovan Richards.
Borough President Staten Island. International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
Ruben Torres and Lawrence Brosley representing President Gregory Floyd, Teamsters Local 237.
Transport Workers Union.
Dave Katzman for TWU Local 100 President Richard Davis.
And District Council 37.
Ray Santander here, representing Executive Director Henry Garrido. Is Robin? I don't think Robin's on the call.
I have not seen her.
Okay.
Oh, wait a
Very
minute.
well.
Wait a minute. Hold on. Yeah, I don't see her. So District Council 37 is
Okay.
represented and we have a quorum.
So Brian,
All right.
if I may, I'd like to ask that Sandy Rich is on, if he could just make an acknowledgement or call the roll, whatever he prefers, with respect to BERS.
Of course, Sandy, there's no quorum, I assume, right?
No, there's no quorum, and if you want me to call the roll, we'll be here for the next 15 minutes.
I
So,
think the appropriate course is just a friendly acknowledgement of everyone from BERS.
yep, acknowledge that Trustee Meisher Sapp is here. Russell Buckley is here. I just signed on, so I may have missed some folks. If you are here and would like to be acknowledged, please announce yourself. I will just indicate that we will administer this business at the next executive committee meeting, which is tomorrow.
And I'll just note Allison and I are here also, as we also sit on the BERS board.
Thank you so much, John and Allison.
So Brian, would you like me to steer this ship?
John, I was going to suggest the same. There are a couple matters of public agenda that I
Right.
think you are equipped to introduce.
So there are two items in the public arena. One of which is the simple passing of a resolution to begin the strategic asset allocation process. The resolution was submitted to the board through convene. I do not believe it's a controversial matter, as we've undertaken strategic asset allocations several times over the last decade. What makes this different for those trustees that have been around for a long time is that we are specifying in the resolution that not only are we expecting Callan and BAM, Callan as a general consultant and BAM to commence with the asset allocation, but that they should also rely on the expertise of the specialty consultants in the event that there are issues that are that creep into their world, for lack of a better phrase. And that is the major difference between this resolution and past resolutions. Again, all of the recommendations regarding the asset allocation would come to the board for the board to make a final determination on. This is simply to begin the process and have BAM and Callan and the specialty consultants where appropriate engage in some of the more strictly financial side of it, where they run some analysis and make some recommendations on how to build the portfolio. I'll turn it over to Steve or Allison if they have anything they'd like to ask. or anything they'd like to add to that, or any questions that you'd like to answer about the process. So Steve, I see that you're on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, John. I just joined. And it was a late start today. So yeah, we're just starting the process with the board's permission to start working with the various generalist consultants on a strategic asset allocation policy review. Given the obviously the change in legislation around the basket clause, we think it probably gives us an opportunity to have more of a or less of a constrained opportunity set. And it's the right time to be looking at this. I don't want to prejudge the outcome because it's subject to that input from the consultant. But we'd like to start that process of review as soon as practical. In fact, we've started it with a couple of the other boards as well.
So while we typically vote in the caucus on all the agenda items, I think because we've introduced this in public, that respectfully, I would request that we just take a voice vote of the board to adopt that we will commence with an asset allocation process. And just to remind everybody, those conversations are usually held in public anyway. So, you know, if no one objects, I'll make a motion on behalf of the Controller's Office to adopt the strategic asset allocation resolution and commence the process.
You need a second on that, John?
Yes.
Then I second.
And if it pleases everybody, I'll just do a voice vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the motion carries. That is the only item that needs a vote in public session.
No, I believe the net zero
R1.
plan requires a vote as
Oh,
well.
I'm sorry. I'm corrected. So the net zero
R1 for that one.
Yes, R1.
John, before we move on to net zero, can I just as trustees, as you know, we at BAM, really Steve, has put together a weekly speaker series every Friday morning at 10 a.m. This week's speaker is going to be Vaughn Hughes, who wrote a book on the role trustees play in public pension oversight and management, including this book Steve made me read. I was beach reading. It was really thrilling, but it was actually interesting and very helpful. And he is going to be speaking to us at 10 a.m. on Friday about the role of trustees in asset allocation in the strategic asset allocation process, and why a strategic asset allocation process is such an important process for trustees to engage in. Unlike most of the weekly speaker series, we are going to be recording this one. If you are unable to join, we will be able to record it to circulate it to trustees. Larry, I saw that. That's for you.
Thank you. Love you
and
guys.
so, but I really would encourage everyone who can to join on Friday, so you can ask any questions you might have and listen to Vaughn. And if not, we will circulate the recording.
Also, if I can just reflect also, if it's appropriate to the trustees, Allison, this is an outstanding book. It's probably the best thing that I've read on public pension plan management. The title is U.S. Public Pension Handbook, a comprehensive guide for trustees and investment staff by Vaughn Hughes. I've read it twice. I actually met Vaughn in a prior position. I have an autographed copy, and you can see that my copy was dog-eared. So he said, "You obviously like the book," and signed it. So I couldn't give it a stronger endorsement. I'm not paid to advertise the book, but it is very worthwhile. So,
And he is a good guy.
and he's a very, very decent person.
He's a very good guy. Yeah.
Can you send the link for what you mentioned? How do we access, the information?
The link for the 10 a.m. call on Friday. All trustees should have a calendar invitation.
Okay.
I think if you don't, let us know.
Okay. And the book that
yeah, Kate, maybe when we send a reminder later today or tomorrow for the meeting on Friday, we can include the name of the book for everybody.
Yes, we'll do. We'll definitely send a reminder out on Thursday as usual as well.
Thank you, Kate.
Maybe just one other comment on the weekly thought leadership speaker series. We've got a remarkable group of individuals that will be presenting over the coming months, including a former vice chairperson of the Federal Reserve System, as well as a gentleman named Howard Marks from Oak Tree. who is one of the icons in value investing. So we've got some, as well as former General Petraeus. So we've got a great lineup. And Larry, I know, I see you smiling there. I know it's not optimal, but we are looking at potentially changing the dates on some of these from 10 a.m. to 9 a.m. Just to accommodate the schedule. And I have no concern about starting an hour earlier. I think that would be fine. So we're still looking into it. As Allison said, we are recording this week's, but generally we don't record them because we want the speakers to be more candid. And if it's recorded, it's going to be on a public website, and it may take away from the dialogue. So that's why we're not recording all of them, but we have thought about it.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, so we have one other item for public. Allison, I don't know if you want to give a high level introduction before we introduce a former colleague at the board and our new colleague in the controller's office. So I'll defer to you.
The man I'm going to hand the mic over to needs no introduction. He
Exactly.
sat on, I believe, chaired this board for much longer than I've been around. But I will say, before John takes over the conversation and sort of guides us through a discussion on the net zero by 2040 proposed implementation plan, that over the last year, John and the team he has assembled on the ESG team, some of whom are on this call, Neha Name and Jimmy Yan, who many of you know, and Jamie Statter, and now Tara Mae Smith, as well as our Chief Climate Office team in the Policy Bureau and the Controller's Office, have been working night and day to develop and put together a net zero implementation proposal to bring to the trustees that is ambitious yet actionable and implementable. And it's been a labor of love. So before I hand it over to John, I just want to express all of our gratitude for the many, many hours and late nights of rewriting, engagement with Net Zero Asset Alliance owners, Paris initiatives, all these other folks, learning numbers that I still don't understand. So thank you, ESG team. And with that, I will hand it over to John.
Thank you, Allison. It's great to be here. NYCERS trustees and staff and visitors. It's a pleasure, really. Can I share my screen? Will that work? I think it'll work. So let me try that.
You should be able to.
Okay, can folks see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Let me get started on the implementation plan. So in October 2021, this board voted to set an aspirational goal of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 to mitigate the systemic risks of climate change through your investments in the real economy, taking into account the best scientific knowledge and fulfilling fiduciary duty. At the same time, you adopted the net zero asset owner commitment of the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative. And you adopted a preliminary climate action plan that required the development of this net zero implementation plan in a year. Obviously, it has taken us more than a year. And I think we came back to you within a year and said, look, we're taking a little longer to develop this to get it right. And hopefully we have, and hope you don't hold that against us. So in terms of the broadest context here, the goal is to decarbonize, really the economy, not just our own portfolio. I like to quote this guy named Mark Carney, who's a former head of the Bank of England, and actually currently works for one of our asset managers, Brookfield, who says that credible net zero plans need to support real world decarbonization, not the false comfort of portfolio decarbonization. And that's what we're going for here. I actually had a guy reached out to me last week who said, I could help you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions almost overnight in your portfolio. And I basically went back at him. He's a guy I've known for years and said, we're not trying to do that. We're trying to actually have an impact on the world because we think that's what it takes to mitigate the systemic risk of climate change. And he said, okay, you're right. I'm standing down. So, and then, you know, we said this when we adopted the plan. I may go back and forth between using you and we, and I apologize for that. But, you know, I think of you all as we. So, you know, we can't do this alone. We said this when we adopted the plan in 2021. In order to achieve this objective, we're going to need governments, regulators, companies, investors in all sectors, especially in energy, but also these other sectors that are listed, if we're going to achieve the goal of keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees centigrade. Okay. So this is the summary of the plan. It's in the plan that we circulated. I'm going to run through it very quickly, and then we'll go through each of these boxes in detail in the following slides. And I can't, if folks have questions, you should just, shout them out, I guess, because I can't see the whole box with the shared screen. So feel free to interrupt me with questions as we go through. So starting in the upper left box, we have disclosure. So the plan calls for us to annually measure and report scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions and the progress of the plan. In the next slide, I'll go over what scopes 1, 2, and 3 are. There's a detailed explanation in the net zero plan, and we'll do a summary of it in the next slide. Unless folks want me to do it now, and I can just do it now and skip back. But so here we get into some specific, this is in some ways the heart of the plan. We propose emissions reduction targets of 32% for scopes 1 and 2 by 2025 and 59% by 2030. We are not proposing in this plan interim emissions reductions targets before 2040 for scope 3 because we don't have the data yet, but we propose that we come back by 2025 with interim emissions reduction targets on the way to zero by 2040 for scope 3.
Hey, John.
Yes.
I think it would be really helpful if you explain scopes 1, 2, and 3. I mean, because we went through the whole thing.
All right. I'm going to the
it'll
next
make
slide.
more sense. Yeah.
Sounds good. I'll go. Let me go to the next slide, which explains it, and then I'll come back. Okay. So if you look at the chart on the right side of this slide, and hopefully you can see it okay on your screens. So scope 1 is the direct emissions that a company emits itself in its operations. So, if it's a steel factory, it emits emissions in making that steel. That's scope 1. Scope 2 is the emissions generally from the electricity that a company uses to do whatever its operations are, right? So, and that electricity can be powered by coal, it can be powered by gas or oil, or it can be renewables. So obviously, if it uses renewables, then its scope 2 emissions are non-existent if it was totally renewables. Then scope 3 are the indirect emissions, and there's 2 kinds. There's multiple kinds, but they're divided into upstream on the left and downstream on the right. So upstream you can think of as primarily the supply chain. So for example, let's take a auto manufacturer, right? So the auto manufacturer needs steel to make the autos, and it needs rubber, and it needs a bunch of other stuff. All of the emissions that go into producing that steel or that rubber or what have you are their upstream scope 3. Downstream scope 3 are the emissions that are generated by the use of the company's products. So in the car company's case, the emissions that the cars produce are the car company's Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 also includes the emissions of investments and financing by banks. So for banks, 99% of their emissions are Scope 3. For our portfolio as a whole, the Scope 3 emissions are 4.5 times greater than the Scopes 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 is like 75% of total emissions in the economy. So it's really important, but because they're indirect, they're harder to measure. And so pretty much all the measurements now are based on models and assumptions. And you also just, when you think about it, like let's take the automobile, right? 100% of that automobile's emissions are not the car company's emissions, because it's also the gasoline refinery, and also the refinery may be different from the company that drilled and brought the gasoline or the oil that turned into the gasoline out of the ground. So you have multiple companies that can have a share of Scope 3 emissions from an individual product. Okay, so any questions about Scopes 1, 2, and 3? All right, I'm going to go back. Whoops, I went forwards. I'm going to go back to the summary box. I think it was on the third bullet of upper left where we have not yet got measurements for our private markets portfolio. So part of the plan is to develop portfolio emissions reduction targets for private markets, which entails getting the metrics, the actual emissions of the private markets, which we're working on. And, which frankly, the markets are working on developing the capacity to measure those emissions. Okay, so that's disclosure. I'm going to move now to engagement, which is the upper right. And this is really the heart of how we plan to achieve these net zero objectives. So the first one is we want to set goals. And by the way, for those of you who were on that discussion that we had in October with the controller, these goals really reflect that discussion. So what we're proposing is that by 2025, 70% of the portfolio's financed emissions for Scopes 1 and 2 be covered by science-based targets. I'll get into what science-based targets are. They're in the plan, but I'll get into that in a couple of minutes as well. And that by 2030, 90% of our Scopes 1, 2, and 3 portfolio emissions be covered by science-based targets. Let me just say, what are science-based targets in a nutshell? They are targets for achieving greenhouse gas reductions in line with the goals of the Paris Climate Accord based on the latest climate science. And so a company sets these targets, and there is a organization, an international non-governmental organization called Science-Based Targets Initiative that validates those targets. And each sector of the economy has a separate protocol for what the science-based targets are. So what this means is that we are not the ones determining whether a company is on track or not. We're relying on the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or if there are other groups out there that do independent validation of a company's targets and plan, that's fine with us. We just don't want to be in the business of assessing that ourselves because we don't have that capacity. But there is this group out there, Science-Based Targets Initiative, that does have that capacity. And so that's what we're hitching our wagon to. Okay, in order to achieve that, going to the second bullet, we plan to engage the highest emitters in our portfolio and collaborate with other institutional investors, because we can't do this alone, as we said earlier. Brian, your question?
Yeah, John, thank you. I just had a quick question about SBTI. Is our arrangement with them contractual?
No, we have no arrangement with them whatsoever.
Okay, so it's just like we log on to the site and see who's on there, sort of.
Yeah, the site discloses it, and the companies disclose it themselves too, that they have
Okay,
adopted
so
science-based targets.
if
This
they're-
is not, we have talked to them, but we haven't, the way this works, it's sort of like the credit rating agencies. The companies pay SBTI, it's not a large fee, but to assess their plan and validate whether it conforms with the science-based protocol.
Okay, so if there emerges a better way of going about this, we can do that without transactional difficulty.
Absolutely. And let me just say, this whole plan is always subject to review and revision by the board at any time. The proposal is that BAM come back with an annual report about our progress. But if we say, or if you say, forget SBTI, go with, whatever, if there's some, and, between now and 2040, our expectation is that things will evolve a lot. But right now, SBTI seems like the most valid approach to determining whether a company is on track for achieving its share of, the Paris Climate Accords or not.
Great, thank you, John.
Sure.
That is comforting because according to SBTI, 300 US corporations have adopted science-based targets and an additional 300 have committed to doing so by 2025. It is not evident to me that 70% of scopes 1 and 2 reduction is going to be achieved with just 600 commitments.
Agreed. And keep in mind, Dave, I'll give you some data right now. Our portfolio is global, not just US. So when we look at the MSCI ACWI, which is the All Country World Index, which comprises almost all of our total equity investments, 55% or 1,504 of the MSCI ACWI index constituents have set some type of target. That's as of August of 2022. But we're not focused on the numbers, like even the 600. We're focused on the high emitters. So right now, Neha, what's the number for NYCERS? Is 17%, is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So the 70% of financed emissions for NYCERS is only represented by 108 companies out of the 10,000 plus. So that's the number that we are looking at. And even within those, if we take into account those who already have science-based targets, that number can be reduced to almost 70 companies. So we are not talking a total of entire sort of 70% of number of portfolio companies, but only those who sort of explain the 70% of financed emissions in our portfolio, which is a much smaller concentrated number.
So we're talking 70 companies which have not made commitments.
That is correct for active engagement to achieve this target by 2025.
Let me just say, I want to say something. If we got those 70, we would achieve the 70%. We're currently at 17%, but we can't just do those 70 because we're not going to bat 1,000 with those 70. So we're going to engage more than the 70. We're looking at a universe of approximately 160. But if we get those 70, we can get to 70%. That's, and we're also, you'll see, we're focused on the highest emitting sectors as well. We're also focused, we're trying to focus on the markets where we think we can have the greatest impact, which means developed markets, in general, developed markets, US and, developed markets, non-US. We also may focus on a few emerging markets, large emerging markets companies that are likely to pay attention to folks like us. But we're not, truthfully, there are some very large emitters in emerging markets that we're really not going to be able to get at, like, you know, some companies in China, for example, probably not likely to listen to New York City that much. Okay, I'm going back to this slide. All right, moving on to managers. So, you know, obviously we have direct access to portfolio companies, but we also want to focus on our managers and ask them to have net zero goals or science-based targets and plans in place by 2025. That's our proposal. And we'll come back to that in more detail as well. And then the last bullet here is, oops, I shouldn't have hit that, is about just transition. What we want to do is, we really haven't made a lot of progress, honestly, on just transition work. So we plan to focus in on that this year and come back to you in the fourth quarter. I will say, and you all should have gotten this from Mr. Berge, that the mayor's office proposed some changes to the language. So let me just read the language that Brian is proposing, that we develop criteria, excuse me, that can, where's the just transition language? That we develop criteria, proposed criteria on just transition. If I got that right, Brian, did I get that right?
I believe the language we ultimately dealt with in terms of being in the plan was strictly on the divestment section.
Okay, sorry.
But we have,
anyway.
I mean, we discussed the just transition concept, and I personally would love to hear articulation of criteria about what that really means before we start.
We'll come with the point of this is that we're going to come back to you in Q4 this year with proposal on just transition and how we apply it to our investment strategy.
Yes, and to be clear, John, that's acceptable to our office, and I'm just very keen on reading that report.
I keep hitting the forward thing. Okay, let me go to the two bottom boxes. They're quicker. The investment in climate change solutions, there's no change here from the goals that we adopted in 2021. 4 billion by 2025, 17 billion by 2035. You see, those are the estimates of what our AUM will be. Those are based on projections that the actuary made in 2021. We haven't updated those yet. So that's just in place. And the plan has the current exposure to climate change solutions as of the end of the fiscal year 22. And we bring you updates on that every 6 months. So, you know, later this year, we'll have the calendar year end 2022. And then lastly, on divestment, we are proposing that we go to all of our private markets managers and ask them to exclude investments in production, exploration, or extraction of fossil fuels. I shorthand that as upstream, but we list that specifically under Brian's proposal. We list that specifically in this box, as well as in the plan itself. And that we develop criteria to guide possible future divestment decisions consistent with fiduciary duties. Should engagement efforts conclusively fail, that could be with companies or with managers. All right, so with that, I'm going to move on to details. We did the right hand of this slide. On the left side, we already talked about the first bullet, annually measuring and reporting on scopes 1, 2, and 3, evaluating tools and data for private markets. We also are going to evaluate tools and data for assessing additional climate risks, such as physical risk or transition risk, and we'll be annually reporting on this. Continuing, so now we get into details. So this is your data. Since our baseline, we set the baseline in 2019, And it was year end 2019, and then we measured again at the end of the fiscal year 22. So that was really 2Q 22. Our portfolio declined in scopes 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 21.3%. The benchmark declined by 24%, almost 3% more. And there are differences in our portfolio from the benchmark. First of all, the benchmark is an MSCI benchmark, so it doesn't include all of the specific benchmarks that make up our publicly traded portfolio. But in addition, the active managers, tend to pick different sectors and different companies, so that those differences account for the changes in the benchmark reduction compared to the portfolio reduction. So then you see here the targets that we're proposing of 32% reduction by 2025, 59% by 2030. And again, we would not set scope 3 targets right now. We do that in 2025 because the scope 3 data doesn't go back to 2019. We only have it for this year. And then again, we'll look for prudent approaches to setting targets for private markets. Let me move to the next slide because I think it's a pretty good representation of these goals. So you see the reduction, and I guess I can use my my cursor here. So the reduction from 2019 to June 30th, 2022 is this line here. And you see that that line, the reduction is much steeper than the anticipated line getting down to 0 by 2040. We actually, believe that to get to a 32% reduction, which would put us at 68% of the 2019 baseline, we don't need, the reduction per year is much less than occurred in the last 2.5 years. It then steepens a little bit between 25 and 2030, and then it's sort of steady as she goes to 2040. And, we anticipate setting a 2035 goal as well, probably when we get to 2025. And all of this is subject to revision. And, much of it, candidly, we're going to do all this engagement to try to get there. But candidly, it really is somewhat dependent on the decarbonization of the global economy, right? So those are what we're looking at. We think these are achievable. They're ambitious, but achievable. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how we're going to do this in more detail. So here's the science-based targets. We went over this a little bit. Again, the 70% of scopes 1 and 2 by 2025, the 90% of 1, 2, and 3 by 2030. Keep in mind, having a science-based target doesn't mean you're at net zero. It means you have a plan to get to net zero. So it's not, we're not saying that 70% of our emissions are going to evaporate by 2025 or 90% by 2030, but that those companies that are emitting those emissions are on target, on a science-based target to achieve net zero in order to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So, and then if you look at the, and here you see the 17% and the 67 companies that would get us to 70% by adopting SBTs. And again, what we say here is that the SBT should be approved by the SBTI or otherwise independently verified with globally established science-based standards. Okay, right now, we don't know of another entity that's doing that, but we could anticipate other entities, including potentially some of the big accounting firms that might get into that business. In addition, we plan to explore methodologies to assess the net zero alignment of portfolio companies based on how well aligned their plans and capital expenditures are to achieving their science-based targets. Because you can set targets, but you still have to take the actions necessary to achieve them. You know, we've seen a lot of companies proclaim that they're going to be net zero by such and such a date, but aren't actually taking any action to achieve those goals and haven't set interim targets, which are crucial. So these methodologies, by the way, you can see 3 of them listed in quite a bit of detail in Appendix B of the full plan. So if you're interested in exploring those, you can look at those, and we're going to be going into those, and then may come back to you at some point and say, we recommend using this methodology for doing this assessment. Okay, moving on. So this is more specifics on our engagement plan. Prioritizing the highest emitting companies. We talked about this. There are approximately 160 in these sectors, as well as the financial sector, you know, which is a huge source of scope 3 emissions. We've already begun that with our engagement this year through shareholder resolutions with a number of banks. That's the second thing here in the middle, you know, where these banks have adopted net zero goals. They're part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and they continue to put billions of dollars into new fossil fuel supply projects, which flies in the face of the IEA, International Energy Association's prescription that we have to stop building new fossil fuel supply projects now if we're going to achieve net zero. If we're going to keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And the banks are more or less ignoring that. So we're figuring out how, as shareholders, we can begin to apply pressure to them. And that's already started with the shareholder resolutions we filed this year. On the left, we're continuing our work with the Climate Action 100 Plus. And we'll be coordinating our engagement with many of these companies with them. And then we're going to be also promoting better reporting and data on scope 3, because as I said before, scope 3 represents 75% of total emissions worldwide. Okay, now let me move to the engagement with managers. Larry, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. Are we getting any buy-in with the other large, like CalSTRS, Texas teachers? And are we sharing the information of the plan that we have? And are they buying into any of that portion of the plan?
We haven't yet because the board hasn't approved it yet. But we plan to share it, publicly once it's approved, and ideally once the 3 boards approve it. When that happens, you guys are first up. You're the lead off with the other, 2 New York City boards that adopted the net zero by 2040 goal. We are definitely collaborating with them, talking to them all the time. Now, let me just say, with some of them, I don't want to say all of the ones that you mentioned, because they're not all on board. And you might imagine, Larry, given what's gone on in the backlash against ESG, that, for example, the Texas pension funds have not been, all that open to collaboration on this stuff by and large. But you also see on the ESG stuff that some of the pension funds are actually, rebelling against this legislation that some of the red state elected officials are pushing. And most recently in Florida, the Kentucky pension funds basically said they're not going to comply with this legislation because it violates their fiduciary duty. And then in Indiana, there was a study about how much money it would cost the pension fund there if they were to comply with the proposed legislation in the Indiana state legislature. So, but certainly, yes, we are looking to collaborate, by the way, not just with US pension funds, but with pension funds, with global pension funds as well. So we're working with some of the Dutch funds, Danish funds, and others.
So, though it should be noted that those funds work in a different regulatory environment.
Which ones, the other US funds or?
No, the
No, the
European, the EU
European.
funds.
You're
Yeah,
absolutely right. No, and truthfully, many of them are far ahead of us, but
I was going to say,
yeah,
absolutely.
but truthfully, we are trying to, with this plan, I think we would become a leader in the US, and we want to use it to spur others to join us. So that's definitely a goal here. We need partners, and we are looking for partners, and the partners are reaching out to us, by the way. So yeah. So there's definitely a collaborative environment out there, and that is our hope, is to be able to proactively collaborate with lots of different types of investors, as well as asset managers, by the way.
Yeah.
We have many of your asset managers are reaching out to us to say, hey, let's work together on this stuff. And this is what we're doing. And it's pretty cool. Now, not all of them, obviously, but some of them.
Well, the reason I asked the question, and I'm glad to hear what I'm hearing from you, is because all the conferences that I've been attending, all you ever hear is engagement. Investment is stupid. It's a waste of money. It's a breach of fiduciary responsibility. And this counters that. And so I appreciate that there are others who are now beginning to come on board, because obviously we can't do this by ourselves.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so with the managers, we're asking them to have a net zero goal or science-based targets and an implementation plan consistent with fiduciary duty. Obviously, everything has to be consistent with fiduciary duty. We're not asking anyone to do anything that would violate their fiduciary duty or yours. That would cover at least the assets that they manage for us, if not all of their assets. And the goal is to do that by June 30th, 2025. And then this is, here we list what we want them to cover: scopes 1 and 2, material scope 3, which is defined as at least 40% of total emissions. So if 40% of their total emissions are scope 3, then they should cover that. That's SBTI. And then if they don't have enough data on scope 3, they should develop a plan to get it. And then in private markets, some of the GPs have said to us, look, we don't know what we're going to own in 2040 or beyond, because the fund that they're running right now has a 10 or 12-year life. So hard for us to say net zero by then. So what we're suggesting, we say to them, if that's what they say to us, we'll go and ask them, if you guys approve, to adopt net zero by 2025. And by the way, some of them already have, almost all of them based in Europe, but some of them already have. And we're reporting this to you right now already in our ESG diligence table in the investment recommendations. You can look at the ones that are coming up in executive session today, and you'll see it in there. But if they take that position, then we would say to them that if you're a control investor, that you have your companies adopt science-based targets while you own them during the holding period, if you don't want to set, and that frankly would have a great real-world impact if they were to do that. So that's the proposal. What we are committing to doing in addition is develop a proposal for you for what private markets that are in non-control investment situations do with their portfolios. We work with the managers on that. So that, for example, private debt or growth capital and private equity, where they don't tend to take a majority position, what would they do? We're going to review proxy voting records of our public markets managers. We've never done that before because we vote our own proxies. But this is a key part of getting to net zero, is how they vote their proxies. So we're going to ask them about that. And that data, I think they'll give us the data if they don't publicly release it. if they run mutual funds, they publicly release it anyway. We will give you an interim report this year and an in-depth progress report next year on where the asset managers are. And then if we have managers in 2025 who refuse to take these steps, we'll come back to you and report on that. And we'll recommend some actions that, you know, will be up to you what you do vis-a-vis those managers.
I have a small question on this, John.
Yes, sir.
In the plan regarding our assets, the plan discusses having public market managers as a minimum adopt a plan for net zero for our assets.
Yes.
Don't you mean active managers?
Well, yes, but the passive managers, you know, so the passive managers, we still want them to have a net zero goal overall. But I see what you're saying is that if they're passive, they're following the index, so they can't.
Or
yeah, I mean, look, I mean,
the index or following the index as we have bent it.
as we, yeah, they do what we tell them to do. So you're
Yeah.
right. But we do want our active managers, I mean, our passive managers, like, you know, BlackRock and State Street, we want them to adopt net zero goals. You know, as folks know, we have been engaging with BlackRock over the past year because BlackRock, and I want to just tread a little bit carefully. You know, the controller sent a letter to BlackRock last September, and you know, we're urging them to sort of stick to their guns on their climate commitments. And BlackRock has been the primary target of the red state pushback on ESG. I think because of BlackRock CEO Larry Fink's you know, statements in support of ESG and in support of climate risk being financial risk. But you know, BlackRock's voting record has been checkered, to say the least, and their actions, they seem to have tried to walk back some of their commitments on climate. So we engage with them, you know, and we'll continue to engage with them. So I don't think we're saying we're not going to engage with the passive managers. We will, but you know, I think that you're right that they, in terms of their portfolios, they have less of a role in terms of our assets because we tell them what to do with those assets. That makes sense? Okay, I'm going to move on. Just transition, we talked about this earlier, so we're going to recommend an initial approach by the fourth quarter of this year. I'm going to keep going. Okay, climate change solutions. So again, details are in the appendix of the document, Appendix C, I believe, of the plan. But here's the summary. We're currently at, or currently as of the end of the fiscal year, at 1.9 billion, which is approximately 2.5% of assets. Our goal for 2025 is 4 billion, 4.5%. And the goal by 2035 is 17 billion. I will just, you know, tell you that the number went down from the end of 2021 till June of 2022 because of what happened in the markets. So it wasn't that we invested less, it's just that, you know, with the decline in market values, they went down. But we're still anticipating getting to 4 billion. But we do, in this asset allocation review, which you just approved, we want to take a look at whether there are ways to prudently increase our allocations to climate solutions investments across multiple asset classes, consistent with fiduciary duty and your investment objectives. So, you know, we'll be discussing that. Okay. And then exclusions, we really talked about this already. The private markets, this is consistent with the fossil fuel divestment resolution, which the board adopted in 2021, where you directed BAM to come back with a recommendation on how to apply it to private markets. This is what we expect to do, or would anticipate doing with your approval. I will just say that our private markets asset class teams say that pretty much nobody is investing in exploration, extraction, and production anymore. So they don't anticipate this being a problem going forward. And by the way, this would be for prospective investments. We're not going to go back to existing funds and ask them to change their investment guidelines. We can only do that prospectively. And then we already talked about the bottom bullet as well. We'll bring back any recommendations to you if there are investment managers or companies that fail to comply with the parameters laid out here. Okay, that's it. Then there's an appendix that you guys can look at on your own with various definitions. So I will leave it there, open it up. If there's any questions for me or the team, I'm going to stop sharing and then leave it to you.
John, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Keisha.
Hi, Keisha.
Thank you so much for that presentation.
Sure.
I am not the most well-versed in ESG, but that was a really helpful and clear and easy to understand and follow presentation.
Thank you.
My only question is around how you arrived at the target investments. How did you come to the 4.5 and 13.8%?
Oh, yeah.
Numbers.
So
Just curious.
That was done in 2021, and it was a model that actually Schumann Ray in the mayor's office developed when I was down there, and then we shared with BAM, and BAM, the controller's office at that time signed off on it. I'll try to explain this. What it does is it ramps up the amount of investment slowly. So there's a relatively modest increase at that point in the first 5 years, and then it ramps up a little bit from 2025 to 2030, and then it ramps up more from 2030 to 2035. Either Schumann or I can share the actual model for NYCERS with you and all the trustees if you want to see it. I believe we shared it in 2021, but obviously not all the trustees were on the board then. And that's how we arrived at those numbers.
I guess I'm just curious, is the thought that you need to have a certain target investment level in terms of investing in climate solutions in order to reach the broader goals?
They're really actually not connected.
Okay.
Because climate solutions don't necessarily reduce emissions. They can, some of them do, like if you invest in renewables and the renewables replace, fossil fuel fired electricity generation, that will have an impact on reducing emissions. But we're not, at this point at least, looking at avoided emissions because it's very difficult to measure. At some point, if that becomes easier to measure, we might want to look at that. And we're also not looking at offsets, carbon offsets as part of this approach. But at some point, if carbon offsets become a little bit more verifiable, we might want to look at that down the road. But the real focus right now is on emissions reductions. So how do we get companies to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases they are putting into the atmosphere? That's the real focus. So the climate solutions approach, really, since we started it, was in 2018, has been, a climate solution can be a mitigation. So, for example, in New York City, we're talking about potentially building up seawalls and so on. It can be things like that. It can be adaptation, right? So adapting to the effects of climate change as well as reduction. So again, I think the climate solutions, we have it as part of our climate action plan and it's in this implementation plan, but it's really not, there's no direct relationship. We could easily achieve our goals in climate solutions investments and not achieve our goals in terms of emissions reductions.
John, I have a question. You mentioned that the banks were a big problem in I think both 2 and 3 scope.
Yes, 3
so-
in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 in particular. Yeah. So since they're continuing to invest in exploration, extraction, and of fossil fuels, because there's, clearly there's still a lot of money in it. How do we effectively deal with that if we're attempting to reduce that,
Yeah.
but we still want to have financials in our portfolio?
Yeah, this is an engagement. This is definitely around engagement. So let me just tell you what we're doing. Let me summarize or restate what we're doing this year with our shareholder resolutions. We filed shareholder resolutions at, well, there's 4 resolutions going forward at banks. And what they do is they call on the banks to set absolute emissions reduction targets for 2030. And so the point of that, right now, the banks that have adopted net zero goals have intensity targets. It's a little bit of a complicated thing, but I'll try to explain it, is that they could achieve their intensity targets, which are basically the amount of emissions over the amount of money that they lend, or the amount of revenue, depending on how you count it. But they could reduce their intensity amount, the intensity measures, while their absolute emissions continue to go up. And they could do that either by lending into less greenhouse gas intensive projects. So for example, instead of funding, let's say, tar sands exploration, which is very dirty, very greenhouse gas emission intensive, or coal, they could shift towards funding other types of oil or natural gas. But their absolute emissions would continue to go up also as the volume of their lending increases while their intensity goes down. So we're saying to them, one way of getting at this is to set absolute emissions targets. I will say there's also shareholder resolutions that others are filing and that we voted for last year that call on them to cease financing new fossil fuel supply projects. We voted for those last year. However, they didn't get very strong votes, generally in the low double digits, 10, 11, 12%. Hopefully if those resolutions go forward, hopefully they'll get a better vote. But we hope that our approach, which is, not a cease now approach, although that's what we'd like to see, it's a way to sort of force them to ratchet down their financing of fossil fuels by having these absolute intensity targets will move us in that direction. But the whole point is that we can engage with these banks, and we need to, because the banks, they play a crucial role. They're literally lending tens of billions of dollars a year to new fossil fuel exploration. We'd like to see that dry up,
Okay, thank you.
Brian, I see you got your hand up.
There we go. Yeah, just before my primary remarks, I want to double back briefly for the benefit of Keisha. And Keisha, you may actually not even need this, but since you're new, sort of like I am, the solutions targets, the reason that they're separate from this is they were separately adopted by the board in resolution. So it's not like, John and BAM are coming up with where we want to be with climate change solutions by 2035. Those top line numbers were subject to prior board resolution. And it's the path to get there that they've been working on intensively. I just not sure if that fact was obvious to you. Okay, so moving on, I just want to make sure the board is aware that there is some known discrepancy between what's on convene and what I had sent around via Melanie, I believe a week or maybe 2 weeks ago. So our hope, which I know that John shares, is that when the board adopts a plan today, if the board adopts a plan today, they will adopt that form of it that was circulated with revisions by my office, via Melanie. And just for everyone's benefit, I know we've been on this subject a while, so I'll make it quick. The purpose of those revisions was to make the kind of, I'll say like path toward divestment, because I don't really even want to put the word divestment too much on the table, but the path toward divestment has a more articulated process for, really identifying those criteria that indicate that somebody's just sort of a bad actor in the space, because I think that for something of this scale, that's not always going to be obvious. Who's really just being obstructionist, who's really being, I don't know what the right word is, and those who are just trying to have a conversation about the difficulties that their company or their, portfolio might face. So that's the purpose of those edits. And I think it's fair to say that the overall thrust of those edits is intended to make clear that divestment is really, really not a preferred strategy here. And I never heard John or his team to be saying that to the contrary. I just, as a very textually oriented person, just had some concern about the way the original draft plan was formulated on that subject. The last thing I want to say is that, I have found John and his team to be super helpful on this, but I will say that my takeaway is that, this space is moving really quickly. And I don't want, for my part, and other trustees may feel the same way, I don't want us to be unduly attached to any particular figure for our target reductions that may be in this plan. I understand that they're important for accountability, but I also want my viewpoint, at least, to be clear that we should be prepared to discard a baseline figure for emissions reductions, or prepared to adapt a glide path for emissions reductions, or what have you, really any aspect of this. We should be prepared to change it as the empirical facts dictate. And we shouldn't feel constrained by aspects of any plan that we may adopt today if just the market for this changes, because it feels like it might. So I think that's all that we have to say for now. Also, sorry, John, I'm very interested in this point on the passive managers and how that, and I don't think we should belabor that right now, but I look forward to that being something that's a focus of future BAM discussion.
See, Dave Katzman's hand is up.
Are we in fact planning to try to adopt this today?
It's on the agenda.
I think that is the hope.
Okay. In that case, I want to raise at least two questions. The first is that I feel much more comfortable with this material in the presence of John's first two slides, which are not the content of which are not well reflected in the plan, which is perfectly reasonable because in many ways they are context for the plan rather than the plan itself.
Mm-hmm.
But without that context, the intent of the trustees would not be clear. The second slide states approximately that we are looking for real world change, not just portfolio change. And there are two aspects to this. The first thing is, if you actually want to do something about climate change, you have to do it in the real world. The second aspect to it is this, is that we have a fiduciary duty to deliver a combination of return and risk that ensures the continued paying of benefits to our members and beneficiaries for the rest of their lives. Right. And therefore, right, so if we were to simply decarbonize a portfolio without real world decarbonization taking place, we may significantly increase that risk to a point beyond what is prudent. And that is, that is why this is so important. And, as long as John's first two slides and this discussion are part of the record for trustees 5, 10, and 15 years from now to understand this context, I have a little bit more comfort with it, though I wouldn't have mind seeing it in the reso. So the second thing is there is a point in it which I have discomfort and which I would actually like to see removed from this resolution. And it is a non-investment point, which I think if it's going to be addressed, should be addressed separately. This is a section entitled Operational Emissions, which begins on page 15. Okay, this concerns the emissions associated with NYCERS as a New York City agency. And I don't think that actually belongs in an investment document. In effect, NYCERS is two things. It's an investment fund and it's an agency that administers pensions. Okay, the operational part concerns the latter and should be, if it's going to be dealt with, should be dealt with in that context, not in the context of an investment document. And that's my objection.
So Dave, let me just ask you a question. I get that. To your point, makes total sense. It's not an investment issue. It's operational, and it's it's separate. Would your preference be that we sort of remove that section and deal with it in a separate resolution at a general board meeting, since it's separate from the investment plan?
We could do that in consultation with NYCERS staff, and if need be with DCAS, which may have a finger in this pie.
DCAS does, because what we talk about is both, 1 Center Street as well as 335 Adams Street, not to mention the Long Island City, which is mentioned. We do talk about consulting with DCAS around BAM's offices where, we operate on your behalf. And I think it says in there, we need to consult with the managing agent or whoever for the buildings, which is DCAS here and whoever owns 335 Adams Street. I actually don't remember, around trying to set a net zero by 2040 goal for the buildings. Allison, I'll leave it to you to respond on behalf of BAM to that suggestion from Dave.
Yeah, I guess my question is, it was my understanding that as part of the fund's net zero commitment in the original resolution that passed, the systems operations were actually included in the original climate action plan. And so that was the reason that it was included in this document as well, because to get to net zero, we had to incorporate our own operational emissions as well. So that was the genesis and rationale for including it in this document, because it was part of the original climate action plan and mandate. So I would be wary to remove it entirely without some plan to take it up as an addendum or something separate, because then I think we would not be necessarily, unless I'm wrong, John and Dave, you guys were around, I wasn't, but I think we would be missing a core piece of the mandate.
So
actually, I don't recall it ever having been discussed, and it looked new to me this time.
Yeah, I'll explain. It's actually in the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative commitment. So we, but in that 2021 plan, we signed on to the PAII. And part of the PAII is reducing the fund's own operational emissions and setting a net zero plan for that. Yeah, Jimmy, correct me if I got that wrong, but I think that's where it comes from.
That's correct.
So, I mean, I don't have an objection. I think we need to deal with it because it is part of our commitment, but I don't have an objection to dealing with it separately. And certainly we can consult with the NYCERS staff about how to go about it. And actually that's what our plan was. We have someone on our team, Jamie Statter, who is assigned to work on that operational piece, both with DCAS here, and she was going to reach out to NYCERS around working on it with the NYCERS team for here. But if it's the will of the board to handle it separately, I don't think that's objectionable.
Agreed.
So, so it seems like where we're at is Dave wants to remove that operations section, deal with it separately. Brian has his changes, which you know, from BAM's perspective, and there's been no formal motion yet, but are friendly amendments. So one way to deal with this would be to say, you know, let's if there's a motion to adopt the plan with those two amendments, removing the operations section for Dave and with the red line changes that Brian suggested, mostly around the divestment language that are in the version that he circulated. And if if the board saw fit, you could motion that and take it up as a vote in that way. And I think that would be a way to go forward. Dorsa or Allison, maybe if you wanted to make a motion to that effect and see if there's a second, but I don't want to overstep my position.
You're not overstepping, John. I was going to step in. Whenever there's quiet, I like to step in. So I will make a motion to adopt the plan with the friendly amendments that were provided by Mr. Berge, as well as removing the slide that Mr. Katzman has indicated he would like to discuss further.
Or not the slide, the portion of the amendment.
I'm sorry, the portion. Yes, I stand corrected. Yes. The portion related to, yeah. Thank you. I got a second from Larry Bosley. So I believe that we could do a, do you think that this will require a voice vote, or do you think we'd need a roll call? Seeing no indication that a roll call is needed, I'll ask all in favor.
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Is somebody opposed?
Yes. I don't know who it was.
No, I meant aye. I was late.
Oh, okay.
Oh, for what it's
So
worth.
this is a NYCERS vote.
This is
not
a NYCERS
BRS vote.
only,
We'll be discussing
resolution.
it separately for BRS trustees at the BRS executive committee meeting.
Okay, and any opposed?
Oh, so John, can I get sorry, let's let the vote carry, and then I want to have a point of clarification, our BRS, if we can.
Okay, and so and all in favor, we've already said aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the motion has carried. Mr. Berge, I turn over to you as the chair. Oh, and
R2.
Yeah.
R2.
This is R2. Yeah.
So no, you don't need to turn it over to me as chair, John. You can still run the meeting. It's just on BRS, I believe, you know, I'm not a BRS trustee, so I don't know exactly what BRS trustees receive, but I believe the version that they have is the version with our suggested.
Correct.
So there should not be a need to do a friendly amendment process at the BERS board on that subject at least.
Correct.
So yeah, that's just
Yeah.
for the benefit.
Thank you, Counselor. Always a lawyer. Thank you.
Before we move on, and I know it's late and we have some managers, I just wanted to, first of all, thank the board for taking the time to delve into this so deeply. It's not an easy topic. It's very complicated. And I also wanted to flag that, as you've probably seen, we have received a tremendous amount of press interest in our shareholder work around banks and climate and in the net zero plan process overall. Our hope is that we can wait to do some kind of big announcement of passage of these plans after all three of the boards that are reviewing vote. But we are in a public session, so who knows what parts of the conversation people have heard, et cetera. So we expect that we will get some press inquiries sooner rather than later. So probably by the end of today, I will be reaching out to trustees requesting quotes for a release that either, if we get proactive inquiries, we will release a statement with quotes that obviously we will circulate prior to release. And if we don't get a proactive request, we will sit on it until such time as we all decide we're ready to release information, but rather be prepared than chasing everyone down. So just wanted to flag that, expect an email from me with a draft press release and some and request for quotes.
Fantastic. So that concludes the public session of today's meeting. I will make a motion that we exit public session and enter executive session to discuss specific investments.
I second.
Okay, so the motion has been made and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Abstentions? Hearing none. The motion is carried, so we will go into executive session. We would ask all members of the press, all members of the public to please log off or be removed from the meeting so that we may conduct the business of the board.
Thanks, folks. Great to see you all. Bye.
This meeting is being recorded.
So Melanie, if you could please provide the report out.
Yes. The board took action on a litigation matter. The board agreed to commence an asset allocation process. The board agreed to commit funds to 2 infrastructure investments, a private equity investment, approved the infrastructure annual plan and the excluded securities plan. The details of these transactions will be released at a later date.
Great, thank you. With that, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Katzman. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
John
Thank
turned into
you,
an
and
auctioneer.